Hello again, and I hope you enjoyed the first day of our Europe Liberty Forum 2021. From our session this morning on economic freedom and the way forward, to our sessions on women's rights, to defending healthcare in Europe, it's been a very fine day for big ideas and serious discussion. And if you missed any of our sessions, you can view them on demand at any time within the program session. Before we get to the part that we've all been waiting for, the announcement of the winner of the 2021 Europe Liberty Award, we have a real treat in store for you. It's my honor to be joined today by Dr. Anders Åslund. Dr. Åslund has had a distinguished career as a diplomat, representing the Swedish government in postings in Kuwait, Poland, Geneva, and in Moscow. He has taught at the Stockholm School of Economics, is a founding director of the Stockholm Institute of East European Politics, and currently teaches at Georgetown University. He's also a resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Dr. Åslund is one of the world's foremost experts on emerging economies and politics in Central and Eastern Europe. Anders, welcome to the Europe Liberty Forum.
Thank you, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Well, we're happy to have you with us, but I'd like to dive right in and ask a very timely question, and it relates to your most recent book, Russia's Crony Capitalism, The Path from Market Economy to Kleptocracy. Now, I remember being in Moscow in the late 1980s and through the early 1990s, and even with all of the massive problems that the Russian people faced, there was real optimism for the future of liberty in Russia, for Russia as a free and dynamic and flourishing society. So what happened to get us to where we are now with a kleptocratic and militant dictatorship in power?
Well, if we stick to the economic side first, the big problem was the collapse of the communist economic system, which was so horrific, but the cost to a considerable extent came after communism. So people got it confused. They blamed the reformers for the big fall in output, while it was the communist economic system that collapsed. And the second economic problem was hyperinflation. The communists left a budget deficit of probably 1/3 of GDP in 1991 and no monetary policy. So hyperinflation was inevitable. But then the reformers had taken over, and they did not have a full political mandate. So they did not control the central bank or the monetary policy. And they were blamed because they were the government, and they were not able to control it because they had an insufficient political mandate. Mm-hmm. And the third problem was too little liberalization of foreign trade and prices. So the big fortunes in Russia were made almost exclusively on exporting oil. You bought oil for $1 a ton in Russia, and you sold it abroad for $100 a ton. And then you bribed a few people in between. This is how virtually all the budding oligarchs made their early money. And it would have been avoided if Russia had liberalized the prices and exports, as notably Estonia did. So Estonia is today the cleanest of the post-communist countries because it carried out the most radical economic reform. And then we have the political side of it. There were two big things that Yeltsin didn't do. One was that he did not abolish the KGB. He divided it into 5 different agencies and sacked half the people. That was not good enough. In the late 90s, under then head of FSB, the former KGB, Vladimir Putin put it all together again. And today, FSB is effectively the arm with which he controls Russia. So you have to abolish the repression organization. And this is what all the 3 Baltic countries have done. Mm-hmm. You can't reform the KGB. You have to abolish it. And this is the same problem in virtually all the other former Soviet republics, not in Georgia, because Mikhail Saakashvili did away with the KGB. And then the other problem was that President Yeltsin thought that he was so popular, and he had a popular mandate from June 91, when he had won the presidential election with 57% of the vote against the communist establishment. So Yeltsin thought that he could rule by decree. And that was a big political mistake, because soon enough the parliament changed colors, because these people didn't represent anything. It was half democratic at best. And it became a red-brown coalition rather soon against the reforms. Yeltsin should have dissolved the parliament in October, November 91, when he could have convinced the parliament of doing so, and then hold early elections. That was what was done in most other post-communist countries. You need to have what the political scientists call a founding election in order to get it right. So say that there were a few major mistakes, political and economic, and the economic mistakes were because of a lack of political mandate.
After, though, so when Putin takes power, subsequent to that, they get run up in oil prices and so on. They're able to coast for some time on that. But recently, things have not been headed in a positive direction economically in Russia. You wrote recently in a paper, though Russia had a higher per capita GDP in terms of purchasing power parity than Croatia, Poland, Romania, and Turkey as recently as 2009, all of these countries have since overtaken it. Russians today are shocked to learn that they are worse off than Romanians and Turks. Among EU member states, only Bulgaria is still poorer than Russia. And yet, the Russian state continues to pour money, not only into massive disinformation campaigns around the world, but especially in Europe, but also military adventurism in Africa, and of course, ongoing aggression against Ukraine and Georgia. So my question is, how can a sinking economy continue to finance that kind of aggression? And then the follow-up question is, why does Putin retain popularity as the economy is languishing?
Well, first on Putin's popularity, Russia had an average economic growth of 7% a year from 1999 to 2008, during 10 years. And it was high all these years. But it started in 1999. So it started before Putin and before the oil boom. So I would say that there were two reasons for it. The first was the quite successful market economic reforms that actually took place in the 1990s. It was messy, but the results of the big reforms usually come later. And the other was that there was a big free capacity, both of labor force and of all kinds of materials in Russia. And only the third is the oil price. And the oil price started rising only in late 2003. Mm-hmm. It was pretty low before, and Russia had high growth. So I would downplay the importance of the oil price. And then since 2009, Russia has had an average growth of less than 1% a year. And since 2014, there has been complete stagnation. Russia's real disposable income from 2014 until today has fallen by 15%. So for many years, people gave Putin, so to say, some credit. All of the growth had disappeared, the benefit of a doubt. But now he doesn't quite have it. So Putin managed then to change the basis for his popularity from economic success and political stability to a national euphoria. First, over the war in Georgia in 2008, when his popularity rating reached a new high of 88%. according to the independent Levada Center. And he did it again when annexing Crimea in March 2014. So Putin has tried to use national mobilization instead of economic success. But it doesn't work out quite well. The war in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, and in the various wars in Africa are very unpopular. But if you look upon how Putin pursues war, he does it on the cheap. Mm-hmm. He talks a lot about his grand new weapons. I don't understand such things. But what we do see is these GRU and FSB squads that are traveling around Europe and also the US and killing people, blowing up things. Mm-hmm. So this is very cheap. You just need a few dozens of well-trained men. And then the other way that Putin is pursuing war in eastern Ukraine, in Syria, and Africa, is that he hires contractors. Mm-hmm. They get a bit of state money, but Putin says, do what you want. I don't want to know. And in this way, he gets a possibility of a plausible deniability. And these people are working as privateers did for the British Crown in the 17th century. They are going out and taking oil or fertilizers in Syria mm-hmm. and finance their operation by essentially looting. And this is very cheap. So in this way, Putin can get a lot of nasty things done without spending much money. So according to the official statistics that become ever more fishy, military expenditure increased sharply from 2008 to 2016, but then they have been stagnant or even falling. But a big caveat here is that an increasing share of Russian public expenditure is becoming secret. So we don't really know how large the military expenditures are in Russia now again, as was the case in the Soviet period. So in many ways, Russia is becoming more Soviet in these matters, but not with regard to the economy. So the economy is still doing reasonably well because it's a market economy.
Let's turn then to the European Union, not leave behind the discussion of Russia, and some of the apparent dysfunctions of the bureaucracy. So our friend Dalibor Rohak has written on the problems of the EU's centralization of vaccine procurement and distribution, and the record isn't that impressive, I have to say. So if you look at the fully vaccinated, as of the latest numbers I had, 43% of the United Kingdom, 42% of the United States, and then jump way down, Germany, 24%, France, 19%, Sweden, 18%, Czech Republic, 18%, Slovakia, 19%, Belgium, 24%. This is not an impressive performance, although it's getting better now. They're learning some lessons. But it ended up driving a number of countries right into the arms of the Kremlin, which offered the Sputnik vaccine. They'd done a terrible job inside of Russia, but that's not what matters. It's a foreign policy tool. But then also the Chinese as well, who use vaccines as a foreign policy tool. So what role do you think this centralization played in this dysfunctional rollout? And what might have been done better that would have been more efficient and more in accord with standard liberal principles?
Yeah, first of all, let me say, as a friend of the European Union, I feel terribly embarrassed by this, because this has really been a very bad performance. But then we come to the question of why. I would argue that there are 4 countries that have been, done well. As you said, the US, the UK, Israel, and also the United Arab Emirates. What has been typical of these? Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says that he called the head of Pfizer 25 times. so that he had private calls. Also, whatever we think of President Trump, this is what he did the best, pouring a lot of money early on and giving a lot of freedom to his vaccine workforce. But it is a centralized decision-making with a lot of money. So I would say that the problem here with the European Union is that nobody really makes the decisions. So the problem is, I would argue, not centralization per se, but decisions by committee, which are always bad. You need somebody who's clearly responsible. So this is what I think the European Union should draw as a conclusion. We must have clear decision-making so that we can become effective. So what the European Union did, it's quite ridiculous. They were very anxious to get low prices for the vaccine, and they boasted about how much cheaper they got the vaccine than the UK and the US. Until they realized that they didn't get any vaccine. So there was a problem. The other thing was that they were very anxious to get good liability assurances. I mean, this is what petty bureaucrats do. This is not what big political leaders do. So the problem is that the European Union doesn't have any big political leaders, and it can't have it because it's a really decision by committee. So what I would rather like to see is strong powers with top people in the different fields in the European Union. So you can say that the two strongest commissioners in the European Commission are always the competition commissioner and the trade commissioner, because they have real powers. The others don't. They have to listen to one source or the other. So the point is rather that the European Union needs to sort out its decision-making mechanism. So either they really decide, or they give it back to the countries, the subsidiarity principle. And this should be a wake-up call for the European Union to say that we can't continue like this. I can take many other areas. For example, money laundering. It's now discussed that the European Union needs an agency to fight money laundering. Because as it is, each country has its own weak agency. And money flows swiftly through the European Union because there you have a liberalization of capital flows. And then one little agency in one country or the other can't follow what is going on. So there you need a strong central agency, as long as you have free capital flows. Otherwise, you need to check it. So there needs to be a consistency between centralization and of certain mechanisms in order to check the liberal markets, as is the case with the trade commissioner and the competition commissioner, that also needs to be in there. And let me give another example. I'm spending a lot of my time in Ukraine. And who are the strong international authorities there? The United States, the IMF, the BRD, the G7 ambassadors, but not the European Union. Why? Because the European Union in Ukraine talks with different voices. So each area is controlled by one commissioner, and they do not necessarily coordinate the policy. So therefore, the European Union is far less effective than it should be in Ukraine, while the US is very effective when it has a policy.
Let me push back a little bit then on the discussion of the answer to this, I think, generally acknowledged embarrassing rollout on the vaccines. In the United States, this had a federal component, but then private organizations, private pharmacies, and at the state level, states and counties. And some did well and some not so well. So there was a kind of competition and looking across the border to see what they're doing. Do you think that would have been another alternative for Europe, as you mentioned. Make it a national matter and then see which one's doing better, and the others will be quick to try and catch up.
Well, here we see that it's very different in different countries. So in some countries, healthcare is very centralized. In some, it's quite decentralized. So if I take my own country, Sweden, there are 22 regional authorities that are in charge of the vaccination campaign, and none of them had a clue. So therefore, they make the same mistakes, all of them. And people say it would have been better if it had been a centralized organization in Sweden. So, for example, Finland and Norway have done much better. Finland is simply a country that takes the state administration seriously. Sweden is too relaxed to think that everything goes. And if you think like that, then nothing goes in the end. So there should be a lot of such lessons to be learned. But the big problem is that Europe decided too late on the development of vaccines. They did not try to procure properly, so that they pay too little. So this is really to be penny wise and pound foolish, that it would have been better to pay many $billions in order to get the vaccine early. And now I think that Europe is catching up, say 3 months delayed after the UK and the US.
A friend of mine in Brussels characterized it. He said that the decision was much the same process as they would take for buying office furniture for the European Parliament, and not the kind of crisis, not the response that this crisis demanded. Demanded a much more forceful, and in particular, being willing to pay the money and not trying to say, oh, look, we saved $60 billion or euros and cost hundreds and hundreds of billions more in lost productivity and, of course, human life.
Indeed, I mean, this is exactly correct. But then you have a standard procedure for procurement, and nobody can overtake it swiftly when it's necessary to act differently. But this is where countries with strong executives like the UK and the US can come out better.
Let me ask you then a question about a trend we've been seeing around the world, so not only in Europe by any means, in the United States, in Canada, not so much Canada, but in Mexico, in some Latin American countries, in Asia, which is the rise of a new kind of nationalism. And this has, of course, been given a big push by the pandemic. When people feel under threat, they tend to become more tribal in their thinking. But along with it has been a push against free trade, a push against free movement, and a lot of restrictions that might last well beyond the pandemic. And now this literature that's emerging about the so-called resilient state, which is another term for the mercantilist state, as far as I can tell. I heard on the radio today talking about the importance of shortening supply chains rather than strengthening or securing supply chains, having alternatives, shorten them, which is another term for old-fashioned mercantilism. What do you think is a good response? How do we meet this as advocates of free and open societies?
Yeah, this is a big and complex question. I would divide it into several different parts. The big rise of populism in Europe came as an anti-immigration movement, and it was in 2015. It was 2 countries that took lots of Syrian immigrants. It was Germany, 1 million, and Sweden, a bit more than 160,000. And this completely overwhelmed these 2 countries, and the others turned against. In particular, the Visegrad countries took a strong attitude: we don't want these refugees. And this divided Europe, and in particular for the East Europeans, it was a turn against Brussels and against the European Union. And we saw then, in particular in Germany, Alternative for Germany, came up as a strong right-wing populist party. And in Italy, we had both to the left and right. Also in Spain, strong parties, both to the left and right on populist parties. But in particular, the League in Italy stood out. And of course, in France, since a long time, the National Front, which is most of all an anti-immigration party, but it's also very much in favor of the old social welfare state. And anti-elitist. But what has happened recently, I would say, is that during the pandemic, these parties did not have much to say. So in Italy, we have now seen a tremendous political development with the populists, both to the right and left, supporting Mario Draghi, the ultimate elitist, as prime minister. So, and now supporting quite strong structural reform. So all of a sudden, after 20 lost years, Italy looks hopeful. And this is a real liberalization of the market. And Italy has one of the most worst judicial systems in Europe, and that is now being cleaned up. So there is some improvement. And in Germany, we have seen in the recent elections that the Alternative for Germany has done poorly. And the left wing, Die Linke, the former communists really, they are also doing quite poorly. And instead, what is happening is that it's the Greens that have really become a liberal party. You can say that it's probably the most liberal party in Germany today. And it's also become the only party that stands up against Russia in Germany today. So they have been up in opinion polls in the high 20s. Probably these are exaggerated, but now the two big parties in Germany are the Christian Democrats and the Liberal Greens, and also the Free Democrats in Germany have benefited. So the main problem is Hungary, with Fidesz, which is really an anti-democratic party today, unfortunately. It started as a very liberal party, and then Viktor Orban, as a very skillful politician, has taken it in the wrong direction. And in Poland, where Kaczynski is the real leader of the country, and what he stands for is really a 1930s view of both politics and economics, not too democratic and not in favor of a free economy, but a creeping renationalization. So these are the two countries that really worry me with regard to what is happening internally. And we generally see a deterioration in Central Europe of governance. It's also in Slovakia and the Czech Republic that the improvement of governance has stopped, while the three Baltic states stand out ever more as the stars in Eastern Europe. So, and coming to protectionism, it's really two countries. The US under Trump, and so far President Biden has largely maintained the protectionism of Trump. I would guess that there will be some softening of it. In particular, the tariffs on Europe are likely to...
We haven't seen any so far, though.
It's said to be in the communique from the G7 meetings. Bloomberg has reported it. So we'll see if it actually comes out. But Biden has a strong standing as a protectionist. So wouldn't hope for too much. And of course, the US can afford being protectionist because trade is only 15% of GDP. So it's so little. Well, it's much more in European countries. So in small European countries, you see that there is a strong commitment to free trade. The smaller the country, the greater the commitment to free trade because the cost becomes so much more of protectionist. And then it's the UK. But UK has essentially done away with all the free trade agreements it had, while free trade agreements have developed in the Far East. And the European Union has concluded a number of free trade agreements with Canada, with Japan, and trying with Mercosur. So it's really two countries that are going against the free trading trend, and that's the US and the UK. So the UK simply abolished all its free trade agreement.
Well, let me push back a little bit on that, because there is a big move now in the UK, and I know a lot of people involved in that, to begin really pressing hard to get trade deals, to liberalize trade with the United States, with the European Union, New Zealand, India, and so on. So I think the chapter's not finished on that one. We're still hopeful that there's going to be a big free trade revival in the UK.
I think so too, but through Brexit, lots of free trade agreements were interrupted for Britain. So this will be a big upfront cost. But I agree that we are likely to see more free trade agreements coming.
Well, that's why our partners and friends there are so important, because they're pushing very hard for this every single day. But you raised a question that we can't pursue very much, but if you're elected into government, your job is not just to criticize government, but to try to implement solid liberal policies, have a limited law-governed state, and do it competently. And that's one of the things that usually the populists, when they get into power, they can't do it. They don't have the answers. They're just driven by anger. And we need to be focused on what should government do. It's a limited core of responsibility, and then do it well. Well, I'd like to then wrap up then. How do you see these liberal principles, limited government, toleration, rule of law, presumption of liberty, what role will they be playing in Europe in the next century? Let's say just 50 years, we can look out. Not just the EU countries, but the wider European space.
I'm quite hopeful about these things. What we have seen in Europe is that public expenditure has fallen a lot. If you take Sweden, at the highest it was 71% of GDP. Now it's about 50% and stays at that level. It should be a bit lower. But we are seeing that the countries are coming together, and we have public expenditure largely between 35 and 50% of the GDP. A few countries from time to time are higher, as now when we have the pandemic. And I think look upon that as an exception. And when it comes to taxation, we are seeing that there is a natural convergence in taxation, partly through tax competition. I'm thinking of corporate profit taxes and personal income taxes, but partly because of EU coordination. I'm thinking of value-added taxes and, of course, the foreign trade taxes. So we are seeing a simplification and improvement there. So public finance looks much sounder in Europe today than it did 30 years ago. And nobody has been concerned about inflation for the last 30 years. So it might become a problem now. So what we really need is to open up the asset markets and the capital markets. The European banking system is in a bad shape, and it's still far too national, and there's still too much of state interference in the banking system. So it's, so to say, the more sophisticated parts. And what is really disturbing is that Europe is so far behind in digitization. When we see the big high-tech startups, they are American or Chinese, and very, very few are European. That's what concerns me.
So you see some big challenges coming up, but would still be in the camp of the optimists.
Yeah.
Well, that's good to hear. Well, thank you very much, Anders,
Thank you.
for this conversation. Now, when we think about how much is possible, it's helpful to take a broad view of recent history. And it's especially appropriate to do so in 2021, as Atlas Network is celebrating our 40th anniversary. It was in the middle of the year 1981 that Sir Anthony Fisher founded this organization. And when I look back over what's been accomplished over the first 4 decades of Atlas Network, I'm awestruck. But more importantly, with such a global foundation and a global reach, the coming decades are going to be really awesome. And to get ready for the next 40 years, we prepared for you a special Atlas Network 40th anniversary video.
They told us we were crazy. They said, the world will never be that way. We kept on anyway. They told us to pack up, close down, don't join the fray. We kept on anyway. For 40 years, Atlas Network has been there to support the dreamers and the hustlers, the writers and the critics, explorers, voyagers and innovators that make and remake our world. Ours is a community of passionate builders, of rebels and reformers, of visionaries who refuse to be silenced. And we want a world that is freer and more prosperous for all. We fight for a woman's right to work and for a cleaner environment. We call power to account. We uplift local voices around the world who discover policy solutions to humankind's most pressing challenges. At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity. We turn ideas into impact. Freedom is borderless. It connects each and every one of us, regardless of race, religion, belief, or nationality. And the fate of our human family depends upon it. 80 years ago, Anthony Fisher fought for freedom above the skies of Britain. 40 years ago, while Nelson Mandela sat in a Robben Island jail cell and the Berlin Wall still stood, he created a research foundation determined to keep this dream of freedom alive. In the decades since, we've transformed from a humble band of advocates who dreamed of breaking down barriers with our ideas into a vibrant international network of organizations across 6 continents who've improved over 1 billion lives through investments in policy reform and our passionate defense of the freedom of all. When people say the world will never be that way, don't listen. Don't accept things as they are. Find a way to change them. Build and bestow your legacy on humanity. And when you feel hopeless, remind yourself, you aren't alone. We're here, right beside you, because your fight for freedom is our fight for freedom. Our path forward is together. Will you join us?
And now, on to the big moment. The Europe Liberty Award is one element of the Templeton Freedom Award Prize Program, which annually recognizes think tanks that have made important contributions to the understanding of free enterprise and to advancing public policies that secure liberty to innovate, to prosper, and to flourish. The Europe Liberty Award is generously supported by the Templeton Religion Trust. Each finalist will receive $1,500 to invest in their work, and the winner of the award will receive $7,000. And so, we come to that highly anticipated moment. I'd like to invite our finalists to join me. First, we have Piotr Markielov, representing Students for Liberty, for their project Free Belarus, building a groundswell for freedom in Europe's last dictatorship. Piotr Markielov is a liberty activist who has stood up to the dictatorship and has withstood its power. His stance and that of the Students for Liberty in Belarus have inspired people across Belarus, Europe, and the world. SFL's innovative media campaign reached over 7 million people, gained the support of numerous European Parliament members, and led the governments of the European Union, Canada, the United States, Lithuania, and Slovakia to impose sanctions on key individuals who are carrying out repression for the regime. Next up, we have Mark Littlewood, representing the Institute of Economic Affairs in the United Kingdom, for their project, Britain Unlimited, the making of a free trade champion. IEA's educational plan took 4 years to deliver, but paid off in December of 2020 when the UK concluded a comprehensive Canada-style free trade deal with the European Union. This amounts to trade deals with 66 countries worth £890 billion in total, equal to almost 1/3 of the British GDP. In January of this year, the UK government formally applied to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership and acted unilaterally to reduce barriers to trade by introducing a lower and simpler UK global tariff regime. The UK is now pursuing new free trade agreements with the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, and it's working with India and countries in the Mercosur bloc in Latin America. And finally, please welcome Roxana Nicula, representing the Foundation for the Advancement of Liberty in Spain, for their project, Private Healthcare Saves Lives. Fundalib's efforts have been instrumental in Spain's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The value-added tax for certain health products, such as face masks, PPE, was reduced, and it was eliminated completely for health insurance. Entry barriers for foreign medical professionals have been lifted. COVID-19 testing is now allowed in pharmacies, and the government now allows the operation of app-based services run by medical professionals, including home delivery of medicines and at-home COVID-19 testing. Fundalib's recommendations for the approval of COVID-19 vaccines facilitated the deregulation of clinical testing by the Spanish Medicines Agency. And the winner is, here I'm opening this envelope for the first time, it's Students for Liberty, represented by Piotr Makielao. Wow. Piotr, the stage is yours.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. Yeah, that's actually great. Yeah, like as for the campaign in Belarus, the last 12 months have become the darkest actually year in the history of Belarus. The country hasn't seen such large-scale political repression since Stalin. And since August last year, 2020, around 50,000 people have been found guilty in administrative cases for taking part in protests. At least 5,000 officially reported the use of tortures against them. This is the data from a United Nations report. There are more than 3,000 political prisoners who are prosecuted criminally, and many of them have already spent a year in custody and were convicted for 5 to 8 years for no reason at all. Just from May 2021, I have some numbers here. We have 667 new politically motivated criminal cases against 944 persons. And these cases were sent to the court. 682 people were already found guilty, and at least 74 persons were fined with an average fine of $1,400. What for? For wearing a white shirt with a red scarf, or for posting a photo of white, red, and white marshmallow, or just for not unconditionally obeying any requirement of people in balaclavas. Students for Liberty has always supported me in my activism. In 2017, when I joined SFL, Students for Liberty helped me to launch Legalize Belarus, the first civil movement for effective and humane drug policy in Belarus. During my battle against the regime, starting Legalize Belarus and organizing many other activities, I felt the Students for Liberty family always supporting me. And for that, I'll always be grateful. I truly appreciate that support. And also Atlas Network, John Temple Foundation, Templeton Religion Trust. Thank you for promoting freedom and prosperity around the globe, in places like Belarus. Yeah, and also congratulate other finalists who are here. And yeah, let's just keep it burning. Let's keep this torch of liberty really lighting the way of the future.
Well, thank you very much, Piotr, for inspiring us. Congratulations on this award. It's what a highlight in the history of our movement, and congratulations as well to our finalists and their very important efforts to bring liberty and prosperity to all the people of Europe. And with that, we conclude day one of Europe Liberty Forum Online. We'll see you tomorrow at 3 p.m. Central European Time for our exciting Europe Think Tank Shark Tank competition. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you again soon.